secrets families carry for generations, buried so deeply they become mere whispers on the wind. Marcus Thompson always believed his transformation was an isolated accident, a one-time curse that condemned him to eternal solitude. At 33, he had learned to live with the monster within, but he never imagined that the cursed blood ran deeper in his bloodline than he had ever dared imagine. The evening seemed peaceful when Marcus decided to visit his Uncle Harold for the first time in nearly a decade. The Victorian house on the outskirts of Salem had remained virtually unchanged since his childhood, its dark windows staring out at the road like empty eyes. The air carried the familiar scent of dead leaves and damp earth, but there was something else, something that made his animal instincts stir uneasily beneath his human skin. Harold Thompson had been an enigmatic figure throughout Marcus's childhood. His late father's older brother had always seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders, a melancholy that manifested itself in distant gazes and long, solitary walks through the woods. Marcus vaguely remembered his parents' whispered conversations about Harold, words cut off abruptly when a child approached. Now, with the curse coursing through his own veins, he began to understand that perhaps those secrets held darker truths than he had imagined. The decision to seek out Harold hadn't been spontaneous. In recent weeks, Marcus's transformations had become more intense, more difficult to control. He would wake in unfamiliar clearings, with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, with no clear memory of what he had done during the lost hours. The fear of having hurt someone consumed him throughout the days as the crescent moon approached inexorably in the night sky. Perhaps Harold, with his reserved nature and knowledge of family history, could offer some guidance, or at least understanding. The iron gate creaked as Marcus pushed it open, a sound that echoed through the silent estate like a ghostly wail. Each step on the loose stone path seemed amplified in the stillness of the night, his boots crunching against dry leaves that whispered secrets in the wind. The house loomed before him like a shadowy sentinel, its windows illuminated by a dim golden light that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. When he finally knocked on the solid oak door, Marcus felt a strange familiarity, as if he were returning to a place he had known in disturbing dreams. The echo of his fists against the wood reverberated through the interior of the house, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, slow, heavy footsteps approached from the other side, each measured and deliberate, carrying a weight that went beyond the physical. Harold opened the door slowly, and Marcus was shocked by the transformation time had wrought on his uncle. The man standing before him seemed to have aged decades in just a few years, his hair completely grey and his face marked by deep lines that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worries. But it was his eyes that disturbed Marcus most. Those same blue eyes he recognized in the mirror, now filled with an ancient sadness and a knowledge that weighed like lead on his soul. Harold watched Marcus for a long moment, as if watching a ghost materialize in his doorway. His eyes roamed over his nephew's face with an intensity that made Marcus feel exposed, as if every secret he'd tried to hide was being revealed beneath that piercing gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made the air around him seem denser, more oppressive. He invited Marcus in with a silent gesture, leading him through hallways lined with old photographs and furniture covered in dusty cloths. The house exuded a scent of time standing still, as if each room held memories that refused to fade. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, creating a ghostly symphony that accompanied his steps toward what Marcus remembered as the living room. The atmosphere had changed drastically since his last visit. The shelves, once filled with history and philosophy books, now housed volumes on folklore, mythology, and texts Marcus couldn't identify, their worn spines suggesting frequent use. Candles replaced electric bulbs, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating unsettling and suggestive shapes. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth it emanated seemed incapable of dispelling the chill that had settled in Marcus's bones. Harold poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if Marcus wanted a drink, his precise, ritualized movements suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd received unexpected nocturnal visitors. The amber liquid reflected the candlelight like liquid gold, but its aroma carried notes Marcus couldn't quite place, something herbal and earthy that made his heightened senses stir with unease. They sat in worn leather chairs that molded to their bodies like familiar embraces, the silence stretching between them like an invisible mist. Marcus felt the urgent need to speak, to share the burden he carried, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. It was Harold who finally broke the silence, his low, measured voice echoing through the room like a whispered confession in an empty booth. He mentioned that he had waited for this visit for years, as if he knew that eventually Marcus would come looking for him when the weight of the curse became unbearable. His words carried a disturbing certainty, as if he could foresee the patterns that governed his transformations. Harold spoke of nights when he felt a familiar restlessness, a stirring he recognized in his own bones, and how he knew Marcus was going through the same trials he had faced decades before. The conversation flowed like an underground river, winding with innuendos and half-truths that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. Harold was talking about the hereditary nature of certain conditions, about how some families carried burdens that couldn't simply be forgotten or ignored. He mentioned recurring dreams of dark forests and the sound of distant howls, details that echoed Marcus's own experiences with a precision that made his skin crawl. As Harold got up to add more wood to the fire, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The back of his uncle's shirt was ripped in familiar patterns, as if claws had ripped through the fabric. The scars on his arms, previously attributed to gardening accidents, now seemed to follow very specific patterns, marks Marcus recognized from his own painful transformations. The fire crackled more intensely as Harold added the logs, the flames licking at the wood with a veracity that seemed to mirror something deeper and more primal. Marcus watched his uncle's every movement with renewed attention, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Harold moved was different, more fluid and predatory, as if his muscles responded to instincts that transcended normal human nature. Harold returned to his chair with a feline grace that made Marcus recognize disturbing similarities to his own movements during the days leading up to the full moon. Each gesture carried an economy of energy that suggested pent-up strength, like a compressed spring waiting for the right moment to release. His eyes reflected the firelight in a way that didn't seem entirely human, a golden glow that pulsed subtly with his breath. The atmosphere in the room had shifted imperceptibly, charging with an electric tension that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand on end. The air seemed denser, permeated with scents that awakened primal memories buried deep in his subconscious. There was something familiar about those scents, something his animal nature recognized and responded to with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Harold began to speak about the Thompson family history with an intimacy that suggested knowledge passed down through generations. He spoke of ancestors who had lived in the forests of Eastern Europe, isolated communities that maintained ancient traditions and understood the cyclical nature of existence in ways that modern society had forgotten. His words painted images of men and women who danced the fine line between civilized and wild, people who had learned to embrace aspects of their nature that others feared. Stories flowed like blood through the veins of the night, each more disturbing than the last. Harold spoke of rituals performed under the light of the full moon, of transformations that were not curses but liberations from an existence limited by the human form. described the sensation of bones lengthening and muscles expanding, the euphoria of heightened senses capturing nuances of the world that remained hidden to those trapped in ordinary mortal bodies. Marcus felt his own nature respond to Harold's words, a familiar stirring beginning to pulse through his veins. The monster within him recognized something in his uncle's voice, a frequency that resonated with the deepest instincts he had spent years trying to suppress. His hands trembled slightly as he held the glass of whiskey, his nails seeming sharper in the dancing candlelight. Harold paused his narrative to watch Marcus closely, his eyes studying every micro-expression that crossed his nephew's face. It was as if he could read the physical signs that preceded a transformation, recognizing the symptoms Marcus had learned to fear. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried an understanding that went beyond superficial sympathy, an empathy born of shared experience. He mentioned that he had spent decades struggling with his dual nature, trying to suppress the instincts that roared within him during full moon nights. He spoke of self-imposed isolation, of how he had distanced himself from his family to protect them from what he might become when he lost control. His words echoed Marcus's own path, revealing disturbing parallels that suggested the curse followed predictable patterns across generations. The revelation came like an avalanche of buried truths that Marcus was unprepared to face. Harold rose slowly from his chair, his movements charged with a ritual gravity that made the air in the room vibrate with anticipation. As he began to unbutton his shirt, Marcus felt his heart race, a mixture of terror and fascination coursing through his nerves like electricity. The scars that revealed themselves on Harold's torso told a story of decades of painful transformation. They were not random marks of accidents, but systematic patterns that Marcus recognized intimately from his own body. Serrated lines where the skin had stretched to accommodate expanding muscles, circular marks where claws had repeatedly emerged, and deep grooves that mapped the path of the metamorphosis that occurred monthly under the influence of the moon. Harold explained that he had discovered his true nature at the age of 25, during a stormy night when the full moon remained hidden behind the clouds. The transformation had come without warning, tearing through his humanity like an unstoppable force of nature. He had woken in the forest hours later, covered in mud and blood, with no clear memory of what had happened during the lost hours. The early years had been a hell of denial and desperate attempts at rationalization. Harold had seen doctors and psychologists, convinced that his condition could be explained by mental disorders or rare physical illnesses. But each full moon brought the same inexorable transformation. Each awakening in the forest confirmed a reality his civilized mind refused to accept. It was only when he found his own father's journals that Harold began to understand the true nature of his heritage. Documents written in shaky handwriting revealed generations of Thompson men who had endured the same trials, each dealing with the family curse in different ways. Some had chosen complete isolation, others had fully embraced their animal nature, and a few had found ways to balance both. Marcus listened in growing silence, each of Harold's words echoing experiences he had believed to be unique. The feeling of losing his sanity during the first transformations, the terror of waking up with no clear memories, the self-imposed isolation to protect others from a nature he could not fully control. All of this revealed itself as chapters in a family story that repeated itself across generations. Harold walked to a specific bookshelf and pulled out a black leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age and frequent use. The book contained not only the journals of Thompson ancestors, but also detailed illustrations of the transformations, maps of the forests where generations of werewolves had run during their nights of freedom, and methods developed over the centuries to maintain some control over the dual nature. The illustrations were particularly disturbing, depicting creatures that retained human characteristics even in their transformed form. Faces remained recognizable despite their elongated snouts, eyes that shone with human intelligence even when surrounded by fur and fangs. It was exactly how Marcus saw himself during his brief moments of consciousness during the transformations, a creature caught between two worlds, completely belonging to neither. Harold explained that he had spent 15 years studying these documents, learning control techniques his ancestors had developed through trial and error. Meditation methods that helped maintain human consciousness during transformations, specific rituals that channeled predatory instincts into less destructive activities, and ways to predict when transformations would be most intense based on lunar and emotional cycles. The evening had progressed imperceptibly as Harold revealed the Thompson family's ancestral secrets. Marcus noticed that the candles had burned down significantly, their flames now smaller, but still dancing with a hypnotic vibrancy that seemed to mirror the growing turmoil within him. The weight of the revelations settled on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility he hadn't asked for, but had apparently inherited along with his curse. Harold explained that the condition wasn't actually a curse in the traditional sense, but rather a genetic evolution that had manifested itself in certain bloodlines over the centuries. Entire families had carried this inheritance through generations, some embracing it as a gift, others struggling with it as a disease. The Thompsons had oscillated between these two approaches, each generation dealing with the duality in different ways. What disturbed Marcus most was the revelation that Harold had spent the last 2 decades observing him from afar, monitoring for signs that the condition was manifesting. He had noticed the subtle changes in Marcus's behavior during his adolescence, the irregular sleep patterns that coincided with the lunar cycles, the growing restlessness that led him to long, solitary walks in the woods during the darkest nights. Harold admitted he had considered intervening several times, especially when he learned through mutual acquaintances that Marcus was struggling with recurring nightmares and sleepwalking episodes. But family tradition dictated that each Thompson should discover his true nature on his own, and that premature intervention could result in a traumatic rejection of the condition that would make future control nearly impossible. Marcus's initial transformation had been particularly violent, precisely because he had not been prepared for it. Harold explained that when a Thompson tried to completely suppress his dual nature, the eventual manifestation became explosive and uncontrollable. It was like trying to hold back a river with an inadequate dam. Eventually, the accumulated pressure would cause a devastating rupture. Marcus began to understand that his recent difficulties with control were not signs of deterioration, but rather indications that his nature was evolving, becoming more powerful and requiring more sophisticated management techniques. Harold had gone through exactly the same phase in his early 30s, when the transformations became more frequent and intense, requiring a complete re-evaluation of his approach to the condition. The techniques Harold had developed over the decades were fascinating in their complexity. He had learned to channel the energy of transformation through specific physical exercises that exhausted the body before the full moon, reducing the violence of the metamorphosis. He had developed diets that affected his hormone levels in ways that made the transformations more predictable and controllable. Most importantly, Harold had learned to embrace aspects of his animal nature while in human form, allowing small amounts of primal energy to manifest daily. This prevented the buildup of pressure that resulted in explosive, uncontrollable transformations. It was like releasing steam from a pressure cooker regularly to prevent a catastrophic explosion. Marcus observed a disturbing display as Harold allowed his wolf-like characteristics to partially manifest while maintaining his human form. His eyes acquired that familiar golden glow, his nails lengthened slightly, and his movements became even more fluid and predatory. But he maintained complete control, the partial transformation occurring under his conscious direction rather than an uncontrollable external force. The possibility of conscious control over the transformation represented everything Marcus had longed for during years of struggling with his condition. The idea that he could retain his humanity even during the metamorphosis, that he could choose when and how to allow his animal nature to manifest, offered a hope he had believed impossible. Harold offered to teach Marcus the ancient techniques he had spent decades perfecting, but his words carried dark warnings about the price of such knowledge. Mastering one's dual nature required sacrifices not everyone was willing to make. Compromises that would fundamentally alter how Marcus would experience his humanity for the rest of his life. The training would involve periods of isolation in the forest, where Marcus would learn to consciously transform without the influence of the full moon. He would have to face his deepest fears about his animal nature, embracing aspects of himself he had spent years trying to suppress. The process was psychologically brutal, forcing a reconciliation between the two natures that made up his dual existence. Harold explained that true mastery of the condition came not from the suppression of one nature in favor of the other, but from the conscious integration of both into a cohesive personality. This meant accepting that he would never be fully human in the traditional sense, but also that he would never be merely a wild animal. It was an in-between existence that offered unique powers, but also perpetual isolation from those who could not comprehend his true nature. The advantages were tempting. Heightened senses that would remain active even in human form, strength and speed that exceeded normal mortal limits, and a longevity that extended far beyond what was natural for ordinary humans. But the price included a thirst for primal experiences that civilized society could not satisfy, and an existential loneliness that few could endure indefinitely. Marcus felt a transformation beginning within himself as Harold spoke. Not the familiar physical change, but something more fundamental. It was as if layers of denial and self-deception were being peeled back, revealing a truth about his nature that he had intuited but never been able to articulate. He was not a normal person who had been cursed. He was something else entirely, trying to live within inadequate human limitations. The decision Harold presented wasn't simply about learning control. It was about fundamentally choosing what kind of existence Marcus wanted to lead. He could continue fighting his nature, living in denial and undergoing uncontrollable transformations on a monthly basis. Or he could fully embrace who he truly was, accepting both the powers and responsibilities that came with his ancestral heritage. Harold mentioned other members of the Thompson family who had made different choices over the generations. Some had become hermits, living isolated in the forest and abandoning human society altogether. Others had tried to find a balance, maintaining superficial relationships with normal humans while living their true lives during the nights of transformation. There were also those who had completely succumbed to their animal nature, progressively losing their humanity until they became little more than intelligent predators. Harold warned that this fate awaited any Thompson who attempted to embrace only one aspect of his dual nature. That balance was essential to maintain sanity and control. As the conversation finally came to a close, Marcus realized that dawn was approaching. Golden light was beginning to filter through the heavy curtains, revealing a room that looked different under natural light. The dancing shadows that had seemed so menacing during the night now revealed themselves as familiar furniture and ordinary objects. Harold didn't pressure Marcus into an immediate decision, explaining that the choice needed to be made freely and with full understanding of the consequences. He offered his home as a refuge where Marcus could spend a few weeks exploring his true nature under experienced guidance, away from the constraints of normal society. When Marcus finally left the Victorian house and walked back to his car, he carried with him not only knowledge of his family heritage, but also a question that would define the rest of his existence. The choice between continuing to fight his nature or learning to embrace it fully weighed on his mind like a decision that could not be undone once made.